They tied her to the wagon with rough hemp rope. One wrist to each spoke like she was nothing more than broken cargo. The preacher's wife called it a lesson. The blacksmith's son called it entertainment. No one stepped forward to stop it, not even her father. Maeve stood in the center of the town square, arms spread wide by the tension of the ropes, the wind whipping her hair across her face. She wore the white dress her mother had stitched for a wedding that never happened, now torn at the hem and stained with mud. They said she'd disgraced herself, dared to speak to a man from the Cherokee Ridge, laughed with him, touched his hand in front of the trading post. That was enough. Enough to make her a warning. "This is what happens to girls who forget their place," someone muttered behind her. The crowd had gathered just before noon. The bell hadn't rung yet, but it would. And when it did, the market would open, and the shame would be made complete. She was 19, and she had never hated herself more. A bead of blood slid down her forearm where the rope had rubbed raw. She didn't cry. She wouldn't give them that. But she did close her eyes and imagine the hills beyond the town, the ones she and her sister used to climb barefoot before rules started swallowing every part of their lives. That was when she heard it. Bootsteps. Heavy. Slow. Purposeful. When she opened her eyes, she saw him. He didn't come from the crowd. He came from the other side of the square. Quiet as a shadow. Coat dusted with red clay, a wide hat low over his brow. He didn't speak. Just knelt beside the wagon wheel and pulled a knife from his belt. A clean slice. One rope fell. Then the other. Maeve staggered, not from pain but from disbelief. The crowd gasped as the man rose and turned toward them. "She's not yours to punish," he said, voice calm as firewood cracking. No one moved. The bell rang. Maeve stood in the silence that followed and whispered, "Why would you risk yourself?" He didn't answer. He just took her hand and walked her through the center of town like she was the only one worth saving. They watched him like he'd drawn a gun, though his hands never moved from hers. Maeve's breath hitched as they crossed the square, not because she feared the crowd, but because he didn't. Not the preacher pacing behind them, not her father yelling her name like a curse, not even the sheriff who stepped forward and rested a hand on his holster. "You don't belong here," the sheriff said coldly. The stranger stopped, but didn't release her hand. "That makes two of us," he replied. Maeve expected him to flinch, to duck or beg or explain himself, but instead he pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat and handed it over. The sheriff read it twice, face hardening. "You're the man from the ridge," he muttered. "The one building the new homestead out past Broken Tooth Creek." The stranger nodded. "And now she's coming with me." "She's no one's property," the sheriff snapped. "Good," he said, voice low. "Then I won't have to buy back what never belonged to you." He turned again, guiding Maeve toward his horse, waiting at the edge of town. She stumbled once, and he caught her at the elbow. "My name's Elias," he said at last. "You don't have to speak, not yet, just breathe. That's enough for today." Maeve's throat tightened. The wind pressed the cold into her bones, but his words settled over her like wool. Not comfort, not pity, just space, something she hadn't had in weeks. The moment they reached the edge of the road, someone in the crowd shouted her name again, voice thick with shame. She looked back once and saw her father standing on the porch of the dry goods store, face red, jaw clenched. He didn't move, didn't chase, just watched like he was letting her go without ever giving her a choice. Elias didn't pull her forward. He just waited. And when she turned her face toward the horizon and nodded, he helped her onto the saddle like she was a guest and not a burden. As the horse moved into the trail, the town disappeared behind them. not in distance, but in weight. "You don't know me," she finally whispered. Elias glanced sideways. "I don't need to," he said. "I saw what they did. That's all I need to know." And somehow, that felt more like protection than any name ever had. They rode until the sound of town vanished behind trees thick with silence. Maeve kept one hand tight around the saddle horn, the other curled uselessly in her lap. The dress clung to her like old shame, still damp, still torn, still marked by the places the rope had bitten deep. Elias didn't speak. He led the horse steady along the ridge path, never once looking back, never once asking if she was all right. And maybe that was why she didn't fall apart. Because he didn't make her tell the story, didn't ask for pain to prove it had happened. By the time they reached a clearing with a rough-hewn cabin at its center, the sun had started to dip behind the peaks. Elias helped her down without touching too much, and as her feet met the earth, her knees gave slightly. He didn't catch her, just stood close enough for her to steady herself on her own. "You're safe here," he said. "No one rides past unless I say so." Maeve took in the place. Unpainted walls, a porch still half-built, a fire pit with smoke curling from it like a promise. "It's not finished," she murmured. Elias glanced around. "Neither are you." She flinched at that, until she realized he didn't mean it as insult. He meant it as invitation. Inside, the cabin was plain but clean. A cot with wool blankets, a pot of stew still warm. On the table sat a pair of gloves that had clearly been patched a dozen times. Elias poured her a tin cup of water and stepped aside. No instructions. No eyes watching her drink. Just space. And it undid her more than cruelty ever had. In the corner, she saw a mirror nailed to the wall, cracked down the center. She moved toward it, pulled up her sleeve, and saw the raw red lines circling her wrists. Her own breath caught. She hadn't cried when they tied her, not when the bell rang. But here, in a stranger's home, where no one demanded anything, her body finally allowed it. One sob, then another, until her knees met the floor and her forehead touched the pine boards, shaking. Elias didn't move. He stayed by the window, facing the trail, guarding the silence like it mattered. And when she finally looked up, the only thing he said was, "No one will ever tie you again. Not while I've got hands to stop them." That night, Maeve slept without dreaming, for the first time in weeks, maybe months. The cot creaked gently beneath her as she shifted, the wool blanket scratchy but warm. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like breath instead of warning. No doors slammed, no boots stomped the floor, no whispers behind paper walls, just stillness. And space. Elias had taken the floor. He didn't argue when she claimed the cot. He just unrolled a bedroll near the hearth, removed his boots, and settled down as if sleep were a kind of promise, not a negotiation. Maeve had watched him in the firelight, wondering what kind of man offered safety without terms. She'd seen men who promised protection only to demand payment later. But Elias had no eyes that lingered, no hands that hovered. He gave her distance like it was sacred. When she stirred in the early dark, she heard him breathing. Slow, steady, unbroken by nightmares. She sat up, knees tucked beneath the blanket, and stared at the outline of his back. Even in rest, his body seemed shaped by purpose. Not pride, not power, just quiet strength. She rose slowly, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders, and stepped outside. The air was cold, but not cruel. Stars glimmered overhead, their light soft against the pine needles. In town, she hadn't seen stars in weeks. Too many roofs, too much judgment. Out here, the sky made space even for someone like her. She sat on the edge of the unfinished porch, tracing the shape of her wrists. The bruises were darker now, blue-purple like ink that refused to dry, but the rope was gone. And she was here. Alive. Whole in the ways that mattered. Behind her, the cabin door creaked gently. Elias stepped out barefoot, a mug in his hand. He didn't ask what she was doing, just handed her the mug. Tea, warm and bitter. "I used to think shame had to be carried," she said quietly, "that it belonged to me, like a scar." Elias sat beside her. "Some scars we earn, others get thrown at us like stones. Doesn't mean we have to bleed from all of them." She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, she didn't see a stranger. She saw the man who'd cut the rope and faced the crowd, not with fury, but with the simple truth. No one deserved to be tied for surviving. The dress still hung from the nail where she'd left it, dried stiff and stained with humiliation. Maeve stared at it for a long time, arms folded across her chest, heart clenching at the thought of burning it. It wasn't just fabric, it was what they tried to make her carry. But when Elias came in from splitting logs and saw her holding it, he didn't ask what she planned. He just said, "If you want it gone, I'll build the fire. If you want it saved, I'll mend the seams." She blinked at him. "You'd fix it?" "Only if you still want it," he said, wiping sawdust from his hands. "Not for them, not for me, for you." That night, Maeve brought out the sewing kit from the shelf beneath the window. It was old, needle rusted at the tip, thread tangled, but her fingers remembered what her mother once taught. She sat near the fire and began stitching. Not to erase the damage, but to mark it, to turn the tear beneath the hem into a line of red thread, to sew a tiny bird across the place where the mud had set, a symbol of flight, not of filth. Elias didn't speak. He watched from his spot near the stove, eyes soft, hands still. "I don't want to wear it again," she said finally. "But I want it to mean something else." "Then it already does," he replied. "You survived in it. That's more meaning than any dress ever needed." She looked at him then, really looked. Not as the man who'd untied her, but as the one who'd refused to flinch from the parts of her others had tried to erase. He never once asked who the Cherokee boy was, never questioned her choices, because he understood something none of them did. That dignity wasn't earned through obedience. It was born from truth. The next morning she folded the dress and placed it in a wooden box Elias carved for her. Not hidden, just honored. When he handed her a fresh flannel shirt and a pair of trousers he'd altered to fit, she smiled, not because they were new, but because he'd made room for her to be more than what they tried to reduce her to. The ropes hadn't broken her. But his kindness, that quiet, stubborn decency, was teaching her how to rebuild. The gate creaked open at dawn, and a shadow moved along the edge of the clearing. Elias stood from where he was sharpening a blade, hand instinctively moving to his side, but Maeve touched his arm. "It's not danger," she whispered. "It's fear." A girl stepped forward. Barefoot, her hair matted, eyes darting like a deer used to being chased. She couldn't have been more than 15. Maeve recognized her instantly. Ruthie Collins, the tanner's niece, the one who'd always walked 2 paces behind the others in town, too soft-spoken to shout, too obedient to defy. But now, she stood trembling at the edge of Elias's fence line, lips chapped and eyes wet. "They tied me too," she said, "to the barn this time. Said I spoke with your name in kindness." Maeve didn't ask how she'd gotten away, didn't ask how many miles she'd walked. She simply stepped down from the porch and opened the gate wide. Ruthie fell into her arms without a sound, shaking so hard Maeve could feel it in her spine. Elias turned away respectfully, heading back toward the shed, giving them a moment that didn't need a witness. Inside the cabin, Maeve wrapped Ruthie in her own quilt, brewed the strongest tea she had, and sat beside her on the floor. "They're not going to come for you here," she said gently. "No one crosses this fence unless we say so." Ruthie nodded, but her voice broke when she said, "They said you were the reason the town is cursed now. That crop's failed because you left." Maeve smiled, not bitter, just tired. "They blamed me for thunder, for bad luck, for wind that bent the wrong way. But what they're really afraid of is women who stop apologizing." Elias entered then, set a small loaf of bread on the table, and said nothing else, just nodded once at Ruthie, then returned to the porch to sharpen wood. Ruthie watched him go, then turned to Maeve. "Is he yours?" Maeve paused, then answered, "No. I'm mine. He just makes space for that." The fire crackled between them. Two girls once silenced by ropes and sermons, now seated in warmth, without shame. And as the sky lightened outside, Maeve realized that healing didn't always come in isolation. Sometimes it arrived barefoot, terrified, and needing a place to land. They heard the hooves before they saw him. A single rider, slow and deliberate, kicking up dust along the trail that wound past the ridge. Elias was already on the porch when Maeve stepped outside, Ruthie close behind, her fingers clenched in Maeve's sleeve. The sun caught on a silver star pinned to the man's chest. The sheriff. No posse, no threats, just one man carrying the weight of a town that refused to reckon with its own cruelty. Elias didn't move from the steps. "He gets no closer than the fence," he said quietly. Maeve stood tall beside him, her bruises faded but not forgotten. The sheriff stopped a few feet from the gate. "I didn't come to take her back," he said. "No one's coming for the girl either." "Then why are you here?" Elias asked, his voice like gravel and iron. The sheriff shifted in the saddle. "Because the church is splitting. Half the town thinks Maeve brought judgment. The other half thinks maybe she brought the truth." He paused, eyes locking on Maeve. "They've asked for a word from you. Not forgiveness, just clarity." Maeve stepped forward slowly, stopping just at the fence. "They want my voice now?" she asked. "After silencing it with rope and shame?" He didn't answer, just waited. She took a breath, Ruthie's hand still in hers. "Tell them this," she said firmly. "You don't tie your sins to the women you blame. You don't get to hang guilt on a girl just because she loved outside your lines. And you don't fix what's broken by calling it cursed." The sheriff blinked. "That all?" She shook her head. "Tell them we're still living, still breathing, still free, and that's more than they ever expected from us." For a moment, no one spoke. Then the sheriff nodded once. "I'll carry your words." He turned his horse and rode back the way he came, no badge bright enough to light the dust he left behind. Elias watched until the rider vanished beyond the trees, then looked at Maeve. "That was more than clarity." Maeve exhaled. "It was mine to give." Ruthie hugged her side tighter. The fence stood unbroken, the cabin unchanged. But something had shifted. Out there in the world, and inside Maeve too. She hadn't just survived the shame. She had spoken through it, and that was something they could never take back. Maeve hammered the first nail herself. Elias had laid out the boards in the early morning, sanded and lined with care, but it was her hand that drove the iron into wood. Ruthie stood nearby, passing nails one by one, her face lit with something that looked like belief. "You've done this before?" the girl asked. Maeve shook her head. "Only ever watched. They never let me build. Said it wasn't fitting." Ruthie smiled faintly. "Then they never saw you right." The porch came together slow, measured, deliberate, every board placed not just for strength but for memory. Maeve carved a symbol beneath the first plank, a small bird with open wings. "For the day I walked away," she explained. Elias nodded once and stepped aside. He never took tools from her hands, only offered them. The sun climbed high as they worked, sweat beading at Maeve's brow, splinters catching in her fingers. And yet each sting felt holy. This was labor she chose, not punishment, not penance. Creation. That night, after the final board was laid, Maeve stood on her own porch. Barefoot, dress clean, arms marked by strength instead of restraint. She looked out over the ridge, the same ridge the sheriff had disappeared behind 2 days before. "Do you think they'll come again?" Ruthie asked, seated on the edge, braiding strands of grass. "Maybe," Maeve said, "but they won't find the same girl." Elias joined them with a tin cup of coffee and sat at her other side. "This place isn't just for hiding," he said. "It's for starting." Maeve nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I don't want to go back, not even to prove a point." "Then don't," Elias said simply. "Let them live with their silence. We'll live with our noise." That made her smile. Small, tired, but true. In the quiet that followed, she ran her fingers along the fresh grain of the wood beneath her feet, still warm from the sun. This wasn't just shelter. It was a foundation, one she had helped build, one no one could untie. And when Ruthie leaned against her shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for opening the gate," Maeve wrapped an arm around her and whispered back, "Just promise to hold it open for the next girl, too." Because healing, she realized, wasn't a final chapter. It was a door you kept unlatched, just in case someone else came looking for their way out. The white dress swayed from the porch beam like a flag, a symbol not of surrender, but of survival. Maeve had washed it one last time, stitched the final bird across its hem, and hung it where the wind could carry its story farther than her voice ever could. Ruthie asked, "Why not keep it inside?" Maeve replied, "Because it's not a secret anymore." The porch had become more than a place to sit. It was a gathering point, a sanctuary. Women from the valley had begun arriving one by one, not in groups, but like whispers too long silenced. A widow from the mill came with her infant and stayed 2 nights. A girl from the river settlement walked barefoot through rain to ask how Maeve had stayed standing. And each time, Elias moved tools from the table, gave up his chair, added another plank to the fire. He never asked how long they'd stay. He just made space. Maeve taught Ruthie to bake flatbread and sew seams with red thread. They laughed, sometimes, small, sudden bursts that surprised them both. Not everything was easy. Maeve still woke some nights with sweat clinging to her spine, the echo of rope in her wrists. She still heard her father's voice in the back of her mind, calling her ungrateful, sinful, stained. But the difference now was simple. The shame no longer stuck. It passed through her like smoke through cracks in the boards. One morning, Ruthie brought out a wooden box she had carved herself. Inside it, she placed a note. "For the next girl who runs." Maeve smiled and slid a small vial of ointment beside it. "For the bruises," she said. That evening, Elias came to the porch with a surprise. A small copper bell, the kind towns used to call people to gather. He handed it to Maeve with quiet reverence. "Not to shame," he said. "To welcome." She hung it beside the dress. When the wind caught both, they moved together, one soft with fabric, the other trembling with the promise of return. Maeve stood beside Elias, Ruthie at her side, the 3 of them framed in golden light. And in that moment, she knew they hadn't just built a home. They'd built a haven. For the girl who spoke out. For the woman who stayed quiet too long. For anyone who'd ever been tied down by someone else's fear. And still rose. They came at dusk, not with fire or rope, but with silence. 10 riders, all familiar faces Maeve once feared. The preacher's eldest son, her father's cousin, even the schoolteacher who'd once closed her door when Maeve passed. But none of them rode forward with weapons drawn. They dismounted at the edge of Elias's fence and removed their hats, heads bowed. Not in shame, but in something harder. Reckoning. Elias stood on the porch, arms folded. He didn't call out. He didn't ask what they wanted. Maeve stepped beside him, shoulders straight, hair braided like her mother had once done before the wedding that never was. One of the riders, gray-bearded and stiff, stepped forward. "We were wrong," he said. "We saw a woman being punished and called it justice. We saw a girl defending herself and named it defiance." Maeve didn't blink. "And what do you see now?" The man looked up. "A woman we want to hear, if you'll speak." For a long time, no one breathed. Then Maeve walked down the porch steps, not as someone summoned, but as someone in command of her own name. She crossed the yard slowly, unafraid, and stood just behind the gate Elias had built. "I won't return," she said, "not to pews that held silence when I screamed, not to a father who turned away, but I will speak if you carry what I say like scripture." They nodded. She took a breath. "What you did to me lives in more than bruises. It lives in the eyes of every girl you warned with my name. It lives in Ruthie's back, in Ilara's grave, in the way silence still clings to your wives' hands." Her voice didn't shake. It rang like the bell she'd hung on the porch. "But I'm still here, and I built a porch to outlast your rope." The gray-bearded man bowed his head again, tears catching in his beard. "You did." Maeve turned, walked back through the open gate, and paused by the bell. She rang it once. Its sound cut through the hills, not to summon, but to mark. A moment. A new beginning. That night, as the riders left in silence and the stars came out over the ridge, Maeve sat on the porch with Ruthie and Elias beside her, not as exiles, not as survivors, but as founders of a truth they could finally live without shame. Please like, share, and subscribe for more true-hearted tales here on Echoes of the West. If you'd seen her tied to that wagon, would you have stepped forward too? Tell us in the comments.